The rich fill their coffers, the poor fill with tears. The young fill the coffins, the old hang a wreath.
Coming to you live from the studios of KMUD, this is Heroes and Patriots. Heroes and Patriots is a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, May 30th, 2024. And as I mentioned, we're coming to you live right here from the studios in Redwood, California, Northern California. Good morning. I'm Mary Massey, and with me is co-host John SAKOWICZ. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary, and good morning to our audience listening to the broadcast here in Northern California, listening to the web stream throughout the country and the world. Two quick housekeeping items. Number one, we have a few new members of the audience. An address a speech that we submitted through the radio show to the veteran of foreign wars found its way to be read at Arlington National Cemetery this Memorial Day. And if we have time, we'll get to that address at the end of the show. And the other thing is my birthday is Monday, June the 3rd. And I raised money for KMUD in the past on the station. And last year, I raised close to $700 for the Wounded Warrior Project. It's time to do that again. And my Facebook algorithm is suggesting Doctors Without Borders, the Humane Society, some humanitarian relief efforts in Gaza, Code Pink, etc. If listeners have any ideas who I should nominate for about a $700 gift, I'd be interested in hearing from you.
Very good. Heroes and Patriots, as Dorothy mentioned, is archived right there at KMUD on our program Facebook page and our website, heroespatriots.org. It's 9 o'clock in the northwest and 12 noon on the East Coast. We invite you to call in with questions on topic for our guest today. That number, 707-923-3911. So let's begin. As the war between Israel and Hamas nears its 8th month, we will speak first with Trita Parsi on the recent op-ed, Biden's Small Win and Bigger Failure in the Middle East. Mr. Trita Parsi, or Dr. Trita Parsi, is the author of Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. And he is currently the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, which we hope we'll hear more about. So we now welcome back to the program Trita Parsi. Good morning, Trita.
Good morning. How are you?
Very good. It's so nice to see you again and be back with you. You've been writing several op-eds for the Times, and the most recent one I mentioned. I wondered if you, before we get into any updates of what's been going on between Hamas and Israel, if you would talk about the article and what was the impetus?
So the article was about the exchange of fire between Israel and Iran after the Israelis attacked the Iranian consulate section of their embassy in Damascus, which then set off a flurry of diplomacy at first, but eventually an Iranian retaliation against Israel, which saw more than 300 rockets, drones, and ballistic missiles being fired at Israel. And a lot of support from the Biden administration in terms of shooting down many of those rockets, but also a lot of pressure from the Biden administration to compel the Israelis to stand down and do not escalate further. The Israelis did respond, but it was a very limited response. And thankfully, it did not lead to a larger regional war, which it very well could have done. And the argument I'm making in the piece is that the Biden administration deserves credit for having secured or avoided that larger war. And it showed that clearly Biden has the ability to put pressure on Israel. Biden has leverage on Israel when he wants to use it. For 8 months, he has not used it to end the war in Gaza, but he did use it to make sure that it didn't lead to an Iran-Israel war, which could have engulfed the entire region. But also, I want to point out, as I do in the piece, that this is at the end of the day an important tactical win for Biden within a larger strategic failure. Because it is Biden's own policy that has led to a situation, or at least allowed the situation to get to the precipice of war in which this exchange of fire took place in the first place. Had Biden pushed for a ceasefire, which he clearly could have done much earlier and secured it much earlier, we would not even be in a situation in which the Israelis and Iranians would have that exchange of fire. So we should be thankful that he prevented it from escalating, but we should not forget that had it not been for his policy, this whole episode would not have happened in the first place. And the larger argument then is clearly Biden has leverage to be able to put an end to the war in Gaza, stop selling weapons to Israel that is fueling and prolonging that war, and he needs to start using that leverage, because we cannot count on getting lucky every time there is an escalation in the region. At some point, that escalation will lead to a regional war, and it will drag the United States into that war as well.
And why do you think he's hesitating to go take that bigger step and call for that ceasefire and try and get it stopped?
I think that there's several different calculations I think the Biden administration has on this, and unfortunately, a lot of them are political. He really fundamentally miscalculated, and he thought that this issue was going to go over pretty quickly, that there wouldn't be a backlash amongst the American public for having, for this war to continue and for the manner that it is being conducted. I did not think that he would not only have Arab Americans turn against him, but also Gen Z voters, African American voters, all are really abandoning Biden in pretty significant numbers in key states because of his prolonging of this war, because of his enabling of this war. I think at this point he's calculating that if he shifts his position, he will likely not win back a lot of the lost voters, but he will lose further voters amongst those who supported him when he was prolonging this war.
Mm-hmm. John?
Trita, first of all, thank you very much for being on our show. You are definitely an A-list guest, and your editorials in the New York Times are widely followed here in Northern California. Your April 21st op-ed guest essay in the New York Times kind of followed your guest essay on March 22nd of last year, where you made the case that the United States is not an indispensable peacemaker. It left me wondering if the United States cannot take the lead in making peace or brokering peace between Israel and Hamas and throughout the Middle East, then who would you look towards?
Well, I think I'm glad you raised that issue, because that op-ed was written after the Chinese stepped in and actually secured a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which has held and actually has grown. And the Chinese managed to do this without offering any security guarantees, did not sell any more weapons, did not build any bases, military bases, on Iranian or Saudi territory. They just managed to broker this because both the Iranians and the Saudis trust the Chinese, and they trusted the other side, meaning the Saudis trusted the Iranians would not cheat on a deal because of the negative repercussions it would have on Iran's relations with Beijing, and vice versa. That's the kind of guarantor role that the Chinese managed to play much more effectively than we have. And as I mentioned, unlike our peace deals, or it's a bit of a stretch to even call them that, there were no arms sales, there were no military bases or anything of that kind. That doesn't mean that the Chinese are in a position to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian issue. However, I think what we absolutely need to move beyond the idea that the U.S. has to be in the lead. The United States currently does not have any credibility in terms of peacemaking in the Middle East. It's just a reality. It has used its leverage for the last 8 months to protect and enable the Israelis to continue to do what they're doing, which ultimately also is going to be to the significant detriment of Israel itself. We've had now 3 UN Security Council resolutions calling for the release of the hostages and for a ceasefire that Biden has vetoed. He allowed the 4th one to pass after a lot of diplomatic wrangling. One part of that I think is worth pointing out. The 4th resolution that was passed a couple of months ago that Biden did allow to pass, the U.S. abstained, did not veto it. it actually was introduced by all 10 of the non-permanent members of the Security Council. This is unprecedented, at least for a resolution of this kind. Essentially, all of the non-permanent members got together. They introduced the resolution together to really show the United States, you are opposing the will of key European countries, of South Korea, all of these different states that are close U.S. allies. And I think it was a critical element that caused the Biden administration not to veto that one. However, in that moment of victory in which, these countries were ultimately happy with the United States, he then turned around and further disappointed them by falsely claiming that the Security Council resolution was not binding, which is a complete bizarre read of international law. Of course, the Security Council resolution is binding. It was under Chapter 6 of the Charter, which means that it didn't call for any repercussions. So it didn't enforce it by saying if the parties don't abide by this, there will be sanctions. It would have been Chapter 7 if it had those type of measures in the resolution. But a Chapter 6 resolution is as binding as a Chapter 7. And this was then, incidentally, that also means that the unconditional call for the release of the hostages, a call on Hamas that they have to immediately and unconditionally release the hostages, was also vetoed or argued by the Biden administration of not being binding. Why on earth would you do that? So in that moment in which finally the countries were happy to see that the U.S. actually had come around, Biden turned around and undermined himself and the U.S.'s standing. My point is, we need a concert of nations, perhaps from the P5, but most importantly, regional actors who need to start taking the leadership and the responsibility for their own security in their own region in their own hands. This actually already started a couple of years ago with the Iraqi government bringing together almost all of the countries in the region through the Baghdad dialogue. And managed to create a forum in which suddenly all of them were talking to each other. And we actually have seen significant progress. You're no longer hearing the Saudis saying that the only type of order they want in the region is one that is an Arab order, one that would automatically, by definition, exclude Turkey, Israel, and Iran. We're beyond that point. We're much closer to an openness in the region for a new regional security architecture. What we need at this moment is for the United States not to stand in the way of it, more than anything else.
Talk about Iraq for a second. The United States still has a huge military presence in Iraq. Is that correct?
I think we have about 2,000 to 3,000 troops in Iraq right now, whose purpose primarily seems to be to serve the 900 troops we have illegally in Syria. And I say illegally because neither the Syrian government accepts them, nor has Congress authorized them to be there. But so in Iraq and Syria, it's not a huge number, but it's important because unfortunately, those troops are constantly being targeted by militias, Iraqi and Syrian militias that are armed and funded by Iran. They're essentially sitting ducks that can cause a war simply by being attacked without serving any purpose beyond that, unfortunately.
Correct. I want to ask a question about backdoor diplomacy. One of the great backdoor diplomats of all times is Bill Burns, our CIA director. And I suspect that he's at odds with a lot of what the Biden administration is doing. Bill Burns, a couple of years ago, actually wrote a book on his experience as a backdoor diplomat with Russia. And he's very accomplished in that area. He's also the former president of the Carnegie Institute for Peace. Any chance that as badly as Biden stumbled visibly, that invisibly, guys like Bill Burns are creating some kind of a backdoor peace?
You're absolutely right that Bill Burns is the best American diplomat of his generation. He is also a profoundly respected person in the region. He was Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East. He was ambassador to Jordan. He is truly an American treasure in many different ways. Incidentally, he was doing the backdoor diplomacy that eventually got the JCPOA secret talks in Oman I described those in detail in my last book on the Iran nuclear deal. And I hear from people in the region, from diplomats and officials in the region, that whenever he's in the region, they've taken notes because they see it as serious. They don't take it seriously when Tony Blinken, for instance, is in the region because they don't believe that he has the capacity or the respect of being able to actually secure anything. However, Bill Burns serves the president. Bill Burns does not improvise or wing it and create deals that do not have the explicit and full support of the president. In that sense, I would say that he is unfortunately under and malutilized right now. I think he would have the capacity of being able to do much, much more and much, much better if he was serving a president that was putting forward a much better plan and objective. He is constrained by what this president is allowing him to do. He's doing the best he can, I'm sure, within those parameters, but you can only go so far with a bad plan, even if you're a master diplomat.
It's 18 minutes past the hour. If you're just tuning in, we are Heroes and Patriots, and our guest this morning, our first guest, is Dr. Trita Parsi. He is currently the executive president of the Quincy Institute, and we're talking about his articles featured as op-eds in the New York Times. I'm curious to know what kind of pushback, or what is the standing of Netanyahu now that the ICC has brought charges and want to indict him and so forth? What is the pushback from the Israeli citizens or in the Middle East in general?
Well, I think unfortunately right now we are in a situation in which the region really has lost much hope and faith that the administration will be able to play a constructive role. I mean, this last episode of seeing that the International Criminal Court has gone forward with its, it is trying to go forward with arrest warrants on not only Netanyahu, but a few other Israeli officials.
Right.
And the Biden administration rejecting it, and even telling Congress that they are willing to work with Congress to impose sanctions on ICC and ICC judges, a step that Trump took and was blasted for correctly by many people that are currently in the Biden administration. Biden lifted those sanctions when he first came in. When Trump did this, it was seen as clear evidence of the danger that his policies pose to the international system. Now Biden is telling Congress that he's willing to do the very same thing because of the fact that these judges moved forward with arrest warrants, given the evidence that exists that Israeli leaders are committing war crimes. And this is not the genocide case, this is war crime case. A week afterward, ICJ, the International Court of Justice,
right,
issued a clear call, a demand, an order for Israel to stop its operations in Rafah.
Right.
And this was beyond what they had done before. Before, they had not clearly issued an order for a cessation of fighting. This time they did. The Algerians in the Security Council are now introducing a resolution that gives that order, because the International Court of Justice does not have implementation power. Its decisions are binding, but it cannot itself implement them. So it has to go to the Security Council. That's what the Algerians are doing. They're introducing a resolution that essentially takes that order and gives it a Chapter 7 Security Council binding decision. The Biden administration has already indicated that they will veto that resolution. This is just what has happened in the last 2 weeks. This has been going on a weekly basis for 8 months now. No one is expecting anything else from the administration at this point. And this is the big difference between now and I would say 4 or 5 months ago, in which there were still hope and expectations that perhaps Biden would shift his policies. I think now the expectation is that nothing will change until after the elections, which means a couple of more months of absolute hell, murder, and war crimes taking place in Gaza. And with that, the further plummeting of America's standing on the international stage.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you brought up that decision. By the way, that was a 13-2 ruling by the International Court of Justice. And I want to read it verbatim. The court stated, and I quote, Israel must immediately have its Israel must immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah Governorate which may inflict on the Palestinians in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. That's pretty dramatic. And again, it's and we're going to have Francis Boyle on the show, and also Michael Link, who served as the United Nations Special Observer for Human Rights in Palestine from 2016 to 2022. It's largely unenforceable. So, again, where does that leave us? It leaves us with ongoing war crimes and crimes against humanity. I mean, there are new reports coming out right now from U.S. doctors back from Gaza that Israeli snipers continue to shoot civilians. This is ongoing. So who's monitoring this? Who's documenting this for such a time that war crimes can be prosecuted? Where do we go from here? And I hate to put all this on your doorstep, Trita, but you're really tuned in. So we're interested in your thoughts.
So the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has been conducting investigations and talking to people on the ground as well as with Israelis about this. And it's on the basis of the evidence that they collected that the chief prosecutor moved forward with arrest warrants. Those have now formally have to be adopted by the court as a whole. But we are faced with a situation in which the Israelis are not allowing regular media to get into Gaza. So most of what we're seeing is based on what journalists that already were there are reporting, or which is primarily journalists such as Al Jazeera, or what people are actually filming with their own cell phones and uploading. And this is probably part of the reason why there appears to have been a systematic and deliberate effort by the Israelis to kill journalists in Israel. They killed more than 120, I believe, at this point, which is higher than any other conflict. And given the way that seems to be disproportionate, it certainly suggests that it was also deliberate. And they're doing so because they don't want the images to come out. We also know from U.S. reporting, I think it was Politico that reported earlier last year in November, that part of the hesitation that the Biden administration had for a ceasefire, as you know, towards the end of November of last year, there was about 6 days of a ceasefire.
Right.
But there was some hesitation in the Biden administration. And according to Politico, it was because White House officials were worried that with the ceasefire, more journalists would get into Gaza, and they would then be able to document and cover what actually had happened. And they were worried that the world would see what the Israelis were doing, and that would add additional pressure from the American public and elsewhere on the Biden administration to stop supporting. It tells you something extremely cynical, which is that there is a full awareness in the White House of what actually is taking place. But in order to prevent pressure on them to stop it, they actually don't want the American public to fully know what's going on. And incidentally, this seems to also then be connected to the effort to ban TikTok, in which you have had at least Senator from Utah saying that part of the reason why they want to block or outlaw TikTok is because of the fact that on that platform, censorship against material coming out of Gaza has not existed. And so young people in the United States are primarily seeing the images, the horrific images of Gaza through TikTok, not through Facebook, not through Instagram, not through these American platforms that appears to have created various filters to prevent the American public from seeing those images.
Wow.
Mary, I just wanted to follow up on this, Israel's campaign to kill reporters. It seems that a lot of the reporting that's coming out right now is by doctors, Doctors Without Borders, and the World Surgical Foundation, Dr. Mark Perlmutter, who I saw in Democracy Now!, who are now bearing witness to these crimes. Do you care to speak about how physicians are now stepping up as witnesses to war crimes, and how they themselves are starting to be targeted.
Well, on your last point that they're being targeted, that is certainly their own testimony. American doctors have testified in various interviews saying that when they leave the hospitals, even civilian population give them their own civilian clothing because they're more likely to be killed through a drone strike by Israel if they are wearing scrubs or other types of clothes that identify them as healthcare workers. This is part of the reason why the ICJ and the judges there are looking at this as a genocide, because it seems to be a deliberate effort, not just to kill people, but to make sure that they also cannot be saved, that those who are wounded cannot be saved. And, add to that the way the Israelis are blocking not only aid and food from coming in, but also medical supplies from coming in. And this tells you something, because it's not that it's uncommon, or it's not that it's unheard of. The testimonies of what is actually happening on the ground is coming from doctors and healthcare workers. The extent to which it is happening in Gaza, however, tells you something about how few others have the ability to share their testimonies, to share with the world what is going on, because they have been killed, because they have been slaughtered, because the journalists are not getting access to it. Remember, the Israelis even targeted the Associated Press, an American news service, and took their cameras because they didn't want what was on those cameras to be shared with the rest of the world.
Rita, we're going to give you the floor for the last 2 minutes here. Our show goes out to key members of Congress, to the White House. We send our links to our show to the White House, key members of Congress, key members of the intelligence community, even key contractors, defense contractors. You have 2 minutes. What do you want to say to them?
When the Bush administration went into Iraq, and that was a crime because it was a war based on a lie, what I think largely saved the view of America in the eyes of the rest of the world was that they saw how strongly that war was opposed by a very significant portion of the American public. Some of the biggest protests in US history took place against that war. They rejected it. They were proven right. Not only was the war based on a lie, the war planning was based on even more lies, and it was an utter failure. I think today, given what is happening there in Gaza, it is crucial for the rest of the world to see that the American public, who in overwhelming numbers favor a ceasefire, in increasingly large numbers favor a blockage of arms sales to Israel, need to show that in ways other than just polls. Meaning, making sure that they reach out to their members of Congress, pushing them to call for a ceasefire, pushing them not to fund further any more arms sales or ammunition to Israel, pushing them to impose actually measures to stop sending weapons to Israel. This is going to be critical because I am really, really worried what this is going to do to the standing of the United States, not just in the short term, but in the very long term. Because remember, it was Biden who said, America is back. All of the lawlessness and all of the nutcase things that Trump was doing, we were going to reverse. And we're going to show that the United States would be a team player, we would be a leader in the world, we would stand up for rule of law. The Biden administration loved to talk about the rules-based order. All of that has been completely trashed, not by Trump this time, but by Biden. Right. And I think the only thing that can salvage the image of America is for the people who overwhelmingly oppose this to make sure that those views are known beyond just what they say in polls.
Dr. Trita Parsi, thank you so much for being our guest today. He is the author of Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. And I suggest that our listeners look up the Quincy Institute, where he is currently the executive vice president. And we are so delighted that you've been back with us to update us. And we do hope that you continue to put us on your email list. And as developments occur, we would love to have you back.
Anytime. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take a brief pause before our next guest. Well, we're coming back now. It's 32 minutes past the hour. You're listening to Heroes and Patriots on KMUD Community Radio or streaming live at kmud.org. Our next guest is from Veterans for Peace. He's the new executive director, Will Hopkins. Will, welcome as a first time to the program. I would like for you to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, thank you, John and Mary, for having me on. So my name is Will Hopkins, and I'm born and raised in New Hampshire. Served in Iraq in 2004 and 2005, and I should mention I was opposed to that war when I went, but I was not a person of the level of courage that those who refused orders and did time in prison had at that point, and I decided to go. And I finished my time in the Guard in 2007 and got involved with the peace movement very soon thereafter. My last 14 years have been spent as the executive director of New Hampshire Peace Action, which is New Hampshire's only statewide staffed organization working for peace. And I took about 6 months off in between and came back as director of Veterans for Peace. I'm a former board member of Vets for Peace and a lifetime member, so I'm excited to be stepping into this role. And I think that covers most of it.
That's great. I know that we've had individuals on before that represent Veterans for Peace. And just to give an overview, if you will, I know that you have 5 or 6 key points that is your mission. And if you would just tell our listeners what some of those are, and perhaps we will get a call in at 707-923-3911 with questions about your organization and some of the recent articles that you put out.
Sure. So one of the things our board is really great at is quick turnaround on statements and being clear about where Vets for Peace stands on different issues. We've got a bunch of different working groups that I'm still getting oriented to. But part of why I wanted to run Vets for Peace is our statement of purpose. And if you don't mind, I'll read it off for your listeners so that they can get a good sense. So we as military veterans do hereby affirm our greater responsibility to serve the cause of world peace. To this end, we will work with others both nationally and internationally to increase public awareness of the causes and costs of war, to restrain our governments from intervening overtly and covertly in the internal affairs of other nations, to resist racism and repression in our home communities, to oppose the militarization of law enforcement, to end the arms race and reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons, to seek justice for veterans and victims of war, to abolish war as an instrument of foreign policy. To achieve these goals, members of Veterans for Peace pledge to use nonviolent means and to maintain an organization that is both democratic and open, with the understanding that all members are trusted to act in the best interest of the group for the larger purpose of world peace. So it's a statement that I've always really felt captures part of who I am and what I believe the world needs right now. In survey after survey, it's shown that veterans are the most trusted voices to people who are curious about the political discourse. And so making sure that this voice talking about the costs of war, talking about the reality that war is, it's never about normal working people trying to live their lives. It's always about wealthy and powerful people vying for control of resources or ideology. And it's always about pitting poor and powerless people against each other. And that it's not only, it destroys our environment, it destroys human life, and it's expensive. It is a complete waste of resources. If you can invest as a society in building bridges and railway and roads and schools, you are increasing the quality of life for the people who a government is supposed to protect. And if you build a bomb, it just blows up someone else's bridge and causes destruction. So it's a way. Our current economic system, which uses needs an intense system of propaganda that is, I think our mainstream media can pretty much all be attributed to advancing a mythology around America's role in the world and how we behave and what the realities are on the ground for the people who are the victims of our foreign policy. So that system is in place to protect an economic system that creates jobs in almost every congressional district. It creates a lot of money for CEOs of weapons manufacturers. It creates a way out of poverty for people who join the military to get benefits and a dignified life.
Right.
And that whole system is protected by our politicians. It's protected by our media, and it's just terrible for humanity, and it's terrible for Americans. And there are such better ways to do it, and ways that take into account the dignity of common people.
Which leads me to my next question. Your Veterans for Peace group is now opposing extending benefits to Americans for fighting for the Israelis. Could you, and these are veterans of Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, such as John is a veteran, and other U.S. wars today. Could you talk about that opposition and why you hope it works?
Yeah. Well, so the good news is that bill is currently given a 4% chance of passage on GovTrack, so it doesn't look like it's going to take off. But the reality of what's going on, I've made friends with a lot of folks in Israel and in Palestine. So starting on October 7th, I've seen so many images and videos of children missing limbs, children being pulled out of rubble, children that are just as human and just as innocent and just as worthy of being protected as my own. And so, while we're, personally opposed to the continued offensive that Israel is carrying out in Gaza, there's also a really strong legal argument that any U.S. support is illegal. So it's the Foreign Assistance Act, the Arms Export Control Act, the U.S. War Crimes Act, the Leahy Law, the Conventional Arms Transfer Policy, the Genocide Convention Implementation Act. There's just so many different legal reasons why the U.S. can't be supporting this. So to offer veterans benefits to people who volunteer to go take part in what the International Court of Justice is currently investigating as genocide it's unconscionable, and it's also a complete it shows a complete disregard for the legal environment that exists, where we're continuing to provide weapons to a situation that is wrong.
Don?
Yeah, it's well, you also have combat vets showing up in the Ukraine too as volunteers. It's a gray area. My question is this: it's kind of like what happened to the Veterans for Foreign Wars and the American Legion. There used to be a time in my generation where Vietnam Vets Against the War was a real thing. It was a powerful thing. Most younger people, if they even heard of that movement, know of a former presidential candidate and U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, John Kerry, leading the parade to the White House where they threw their medals, their silver stars and their bronze stars and their combat infantryman badges across the fence at the White House, and told America to take back their war. And it was very, very powerful, and it lasted several years. It started in I think March 1967. You had the membership size was over 10,000 decorated combat vets. You had Operation Raw, Rapid American Withdrawal. You had the Winter Solstice investigation. You had the Dewey Canyon 3 incident. You had the Walter Reed Memorial Service. You had Operation POW. You had the occupation of the Statue of Liberty. These were major events undertaken by Vietnam vets against the war. What happened to the peace movement within the community of combat vets?
Well, that's a yeah. It's a big question. We certainly exist. Vietnam Vets Against the War still exists as an organization. Veterans for Peace has 12,000 members across the U.S. Common Defense is an organization that's doing a lot of good anti-war work. It's a veterans organization, and then About Face is an organization of post 9/11 vets. I've been arrested 3 times protesting the war. I've organized protests and been a part of legislative efforts and educational programming. And so it's not the peace movement is not as powerful as it was in 1968, but even now on college campuses, we're seeing those encampments popping up. I think one of the major differences is that our media is really disciplined about the mainstream media is really disciplined about not giving any airtime to anti-war protest and anti-war actions.
Why do you think that is, Will?
Well, I think that you've got interlocking directorates and stock options, but I also, not to be conspiratorial, but I do think that we know from Freedom of Information Act that most of the major media outlets in the 60s and 70s were paid to keep a message that supported U.S. imperialism. And I don't think there's any, certainly if we look at the behavior of the media, it doesn't suggest that those payments ever stopped, that there was ever a time when the media wasn't very much beholden to U.S. intelligence mechanisms. And again, I don't mean to be conspiratorial here. We know that it happened back then, and we don't have any evidence that it stopped. And certainly, I think that anybody who has seen, I was in Iraq, and I would watch the news in the evening, and the reality on the ground was so vastly different from what was being reported. And I think anybody who has friends in other countries knows that the media is dutifully, the mainstream media is dutifully spinning a narrative of American exceptionalism and spinning a narrative that supports military intervention and dehumanizes people who aren't American. And I think that's whatever the reasons for it are, it's a reality that we have to face, that our media is being dishonest. And I have trouble even listening to the morning podcast from Michael Barbaro, because the things that are said are in my opinion very slanted towards a narrative that supports whatever keeps the arms industry strong. And I think we have bipartisan agreement in Congress too. The military Keynesianism is the order of the day. You want bipartisan agreement to bring jobs home to your district, they've got to be military jobs. And that's something that both parties buy into thoroughly. And it's a system that is very well protected, and I think intentionally protected.
The fiscal year 2025 Pentagon budget is $850 billion. $850 billion. Think about how that money could be better spent. Will, I want to ask you about just some of the lies and myths that America seems to so willingly embrace. One of the phrases that makes my blood boil is, I'll show up at peace rallies or the VFW Hall in the American Legion and do my thing, and people will shoot back. Well, SAKOWICZ, freedom isn't free. Freedom isn't free. We're not fighting for freedom. And we didn't fight for freedom.
Like imperialism.
Yeah, again, it's imperialism and American adventurism and we weren't fighting for freedom in Vietnam. It was a false flag attack. The Gulf, the assassination of the M. Ben Phu was orchestrated by the CIA. We weren't fighting for freedom in Iraq. It was faulty intelligence, literally ordered up by President Bush about weapons of mass destruction. That wasn't there. Just wasn't there. He ordered that up, that false intelligence, like he was ordering up Hawaiian-style pizza from Pizza Hut. Yeah. He literally ordered false intelligence.
Absolutely.
Afghanistan. Why were we in Afghanistan? Osama bin Laden wasn't in Afghanistan. He was always in Pakistan. We weren't looking for Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. We were there for some other reason, but it wasn't to find Osama bin Laden. But yet, SAKOWICZ, freedom isn't free. That's why we're fighting, buddy, to keep America free. Why do we embrace such lunacy?
Yeah. It's one of those pervasive myths, right? That U.S. militarism is about protecting, even saying U.S. interests. There are moneyed interests that we protect, but I certainly don't profit from the iron or the cobalt or the bauxite or the gold or the Caspian pipeline in Afghanistan. Not that we were able to ever build the Caspian pipeline in Afghanistan. But there are people who do, people who have extreme access to elected officials through their electoral funding. That mythology, again, it's part of that system that protects militarism and military Keynesianism. It's protecting an economic system that is based in military manufacturing, and a system that depends on economic growth through military manufacturing. And that's the same reason we see the Pentagon budget growing by leaps and bounds every year, while other funding priorities starve. The why of it is largely money.
So I have a follow-up. The other phrase that bothers me is, "Thank you for your service." Hey, Will, thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. We've had Matt Ho on our show many times. He's a great friend to our show, and he's a great personal friend. He was company commander of a Marine headquarters company in Kabul, 100% disabled vet, speaks widely about moral injury by combat vets, ran for U.S. Senate in South Carolina. When I die, I hope Matt and I can meet up and have a beer or something. He's a real brother. It bothers him also. Thank you for your service, Matt. Thank you for your service, Captain Ho. The question is, who did I serve? I served U.S. military interests. I served the war machine. I served the profiteers in the defense industry. Exactly who did I serve? Does that phrase bother you as well? Hey, Will, thank you for your service.
Yeah, I actually did a workshop on the phrase "thank you for your service" once, and it makes me uncomfortable because I went to Iraq and I terrorized people, I fought people who were defending their own homeland against foreign invaders. Which, if anything, when I joined the military, it was thinking I want to defend my family and my community against any threats. And so the the absurdity that anything I did in Iraq did anything for somebody who's who I meet in the grocery store, or who notices my license plate. It goes back to that need for a structure that mythologizes what American military adventurism is and what it does. It speaks right to your first objection, the fighting for freedom and democracy. It's like, that's not what we're doing. We're fighting for profit. We're fighting for control of resources. We're fighting for control of the Straits of Hormuz, and frankly, we're fighting just to keep the military-industrial complex flush, keep those jobs flowing, and those stock dividends flowing, and those high-paid CEO jobs at Raytheon and BAE and Lockheed Martin. So the thank you for your service is tied to that, that idea that I fought for their freedom, and certainly Iraq's not any better off for the $1 trillion we spent and the lives that we lost. The U.S. is not better off for the money that we spent and the lives that we lost. Nobody walking down the street is any freer because of what we did in Iraq or Afghanistan. So it does make me uncomfortable, and it reminds me of my own shame and guilt around what I was a part of. I remember pointing my gun at a car with a family that got too close to one of our convoys. And what does that do to a kid to have someone point a gun at their family, at their father while they're driving a car? How does that trauma echo through their lives and through generations? And how do I may have joined the military thinking I would be defending my community and my family, and that I'd be it was National Guard, so I thought, in ice storms I'll be there to help get people food, and I may have had good intentions, but what I did was I did violence on behalf of a system that was there for profit and control of the oil fields.
It seems like that the World War II, which was a very different war. We were attacked, excuse me, and our guys coming home and all the patriotism and all that. Those of us that are old enough who had parents who were there, who have shared that with us, it seems like that kind of welcoming home and purpose has spilled over into these other false flag wars.
Yeah.
And it's not the same when our guys come home. And as you rightly put, what have we gained as U.S. citizens from being in Iraq or Israel, etc.? You want to comment on that in the last minute we have?
Well, sure. We're all taught starting in kindergarten that veterans are heroes. We're asked to say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning in public schools. Part of the curriculum is around making heroes of folks who've served, and so it's not as if I can hold people responsible when they say thank you for their service. There's an entire system that teaches and indoctrinates Americans that we are a force for goodness and truth and democracy. And unfortunately, the reason Veterans for Peace exists is because we have seen the truth of it, and we know that that's not the reality, that we're doing harm. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say we want to thank you, Will, for being with us. Just so post Memorial Day, we just all celebrated it this past Monday, and we thank you for being our guest, representing Veterans for Peace. How can folks find you before we say goodbye?
veteransforpeace.org.
I want Will to stay on for this last segment.
Oh, okay. Very good.
I'll stick around.
Yeah, so we thank Will. We're going to hear now a poem that was sent to us.
It's a speech.
It's a speech, excuse me. And it's called The Memorial Day Speech I Never Made. And we'd like to close out the show with this thought.
So this came through the station. It was forwarded through local VFWs, which was forwarded to the national VFW, and it was read at Arlington Cemetery on Memorial Day. The speech I never made. This Memorial Day, I mourn all our killed in action, all our KIAs, but I also mourn the death of the boy I once was. Before Vietnam, I was fun. I was a goofball. I was the class clown. I had no deep thoughts, no dark moods, no long hours staring at the bottom of a whiskey glass. As a boy, I worshiped my grandmother who helped raise me. I fished from the causeway that traversed our reservoir. I waited for the geese who honked their way past the same causeway every autumn. I guess I enjoyed a childhood of white middle-class privilege. We never thought much about such things back in the 1950s and 60s. I graduated high school a year early, got a college scholarship, but instead of college, I traveled to the United States and Mexico, read Alan Watts, and lived in a VW bus. I got busted in Leadville, Colorado for dealing pot and took a deal by enlisting in the United States Marine Corps. In a hellhole called Vietnam, I learned I was not so privileged, not so magnificent, not so immortal, and I learned fast. I learned I would come to love my M60 more than I would love anything else in the world, any other person in the world, anything. What now? On this Memorial Day, I listened to the speeches made by old men like me. The rostrum holds about a dozen of us. Strange how we will not hear what we don't want to hear. How America's last wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan were all illegal, immoral wars intended to prop up the corrupt regime of failed states. How the governments and militaries that all fell in these failed states were not merely corrupt, but were filthy, sleazy, miserably corrupt. And they had insurmountable morale problems among their own troops from the beginning of their stupid wars. How the pretext for these wars in Iraq, and Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan were based on false flag attacks and false intelligence and outright lies. How these wars had nothing to do with American values like freedom and democracy. How the biggest lie of all was that we fought to keep America free. What do I want to say when it's my turn to speak this Memorial Day? I want to say that the Gulf of Tonkin was a false flag attack. I want to say that the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq had never existed. I want to say Osama bin Laden wasn't hiding out in Afghanistan. He was in Pakistan the whole time. I want to say America's leaders and policymakers exist to serve the profiteers of the defense industry. I want to say that war is America's chief export. I want to say that war is the American economy, and it's been that way since World War II. And I want to say that war is a business, and business has never been better. But I won't say these things. I'll choke on my words and sit down. I'll hand the notes for this speech to the decorated vet sitting next to me. Maybe he'll read them, maybe he won't. Mainly, I'll lament the loss of my men in my unit. I'll lament the loss of my loss of language to express my sorrow and anger at them dying for nothing and dying before me. Nothing. I'll lament the loss of innocence. What does it mean to be a patriot? At 72 years old and a chest full of ribbons, I don't know anymore. I just don't. One last thing, and it's important. I stand with Gold Star families. I stand with the mothers and fathers. I stand with their surviving children. I stand with the widows. I stand with their children. After all the harmonic bullshit about America being the world's policeman, and after all the headbutting in Washington over the fiscal year 25, $850 billion defense budget, and after all the warmongering that reverberates from one generation